crystal flute felt cold against her trembling fingers, a stark contrast to the fire raging in her gut. Across the opulent ballroom, her husband, the man who had promised her forever, was laughing. He wasn't looking at her, his 8 months pregnant wife, but at the woman beside him, whose hand rested possessively on his arm. The woman's eyes, sharp and predatory, met hers. A cruel, knowing smirk played on her lips as she leaned in, her gaze dropping pointedly to the swell of her belly before returning to mock her. In that moment she knew. The whispers were true, but they didn't know her truth, her secret. They saw a fragile, heartbroken wife. They had no idea she held the key to the entire empire, a legacy sealed in wax, waiting for the perfect moment to shatter their gilded world. The city sprawled beneath their penthouse window, a glittering tapestry of a million distant lives. Yet she had never felt more alone. The apartment, a sterile masterpiece of glass, chrome, and minimalist art, was less a home and more a beautiful, silent vault. Every surface gleamed under the recessed lighting. Every cushion was perfectly plumped by a staff she rarely saw. It was a life curated for a magazine, devoid of fingerprints or warmth. She traced the condensation her breath made on the floor-to-ceiling window, her reflection a ghostly silhouette against the skyline. Her hand rested instinctively on the firm, round curve of her belly, a silent conversation with the new life stirring within her. This child, her child, was the only real thing in this gilded cage. Her husband was a man forged in the crucible of ambition. He didn't walk into rooms. He conquered them. His voice, a low baritone that commanded boardrooms and soothed investors, had once been the melody of her world. Now its cadence was a constant reminder of the growing chasm between them. He was a phantom in their home, a presence felt more in his absence than his company. He moved through the apartment in the pre-dawn hours and returned long after she had succumbed to a fitful, lonely sleep, the scent of his expensive cologne on his pillow, her only proof he'd been there at all. When he was home, a strange, impenetrable wall stood between them. His smiles were fleeting, his touches perfunctory. He would ask about her doctor's appointments with the same detached interest he'd inquire about stock prices, his eyes already drifting back to the ever-present glow of his phone. Tonight was the annual Foundation Gala, the crown jewel of the city's philanthropic scene. It was an event he orchestrated, a testament to his power and influence. For her, it was an obligation, another performance in their elaborate play. Her gown, a shimmering cascade of silver silk custom-made to accommodate her pregnancy, hung waiting. It felt like a costume for a role she no longer understood, the adoring, supportive wife of a titan of industry. She remembered a time when the prospect of such an evening would have filled her with a nervous excitement, a time when his hand on the small of her back felt like an anchor, not a formality. That was before the silence had crept in, insidious and suffocating. It started subtly. A late night at the office became 2, then 3. Business trips were extended without explanation. The easy laughter that had once filled their spaces faded into a polite, strained quiet. She tried to breach the silence, to ask the questions that clawed at her throat in the dead of night. "Are you happy? Are we okay?" But his answers were always the same deflections, blaming stress, a difficult merger, the pressures of the empire he was building. He made her feel as though her concerns were an inconvenience, a distraction from the far more important world he inhabited. A sharp, painful memory surfaced, unbidden. It was from a time long before the penthouse and the galas, a time of shared dreams in a cramped apartment that was more home than this palace in the sky had ever been. It was the memory of another loss, a different kind of emptiness. Years ago, another pregnancy had ended in a quiet, sterile hospital room, a silent birth that had hollowed out a piece of her soul. The grief had been a tidal wave, and for a while they had clung to each other like shipwreck survivors. But he had recovered his footing first, throwing himself back into his work with a ferocity that bordered on obsession. His ambition became his lifeboat, while she was left adrift in a sea of sorrow. He hadn't known how to navigate her grief, so he had simply sailed away. This new baby, this precious, kicking life, was a miracle she hadn't dared to hope for. It was her second chance, not just at motherhood, but at feeling something real again. Yet the joy was tinged with a persistent, gnawing fear. The past had taught her how fragile happiness could be, how quickly it could be snatched away. The trauma had left an invisible scar, a constant hum of anxiety beneath the surface. Sometimes she would wake in a cold sweat, her heart pounding, the ghost of that earlier pain wrapping its icy fingers around her. She needed him to be her anchor now, to see the fear in her eyes and promise her that this time would be different. But he didn't see her. He looked right through her. She pushed herself away from the window and walked towards the bedroom. The silver dress mocked her from its hanger. She thought of the woman she'd seen him with in a candid photo on a gossip blog last month. The caption had called her a rising star in the company's marketing division. She was sharp, sleek, and ambitious. Everything she felt she was not. He had dismissed it, of course. A business lunch, a calculated smear by a rival. She had chosen to believe him because the alternative was too terrifying to contemplate. But the image was seared into her mind. The woman's bright, hungry smile, the way she leaned into him, a gesture a little too familiar, a little too intimate. As she stepped into the gown, the cool silk sliding over her skin, she felt a strange resolve settle over her. Tonight, she would not be a ghost in her own life. She would not be a passive spectator. She would watch him. She would watch the woman from the photograph, who would undoubtedly be there. She would search for the truth in the stolen glances, the hidden smiles, the subtle betrayals that happened in plain sight. Her child deserved more than a father who was a stranger and a mother who was a shadow. This gilded cage had been of his making, but she was the one who held a key he had long forgotten, a relic from a time when his promises were sacred and his heart was hers. She had never considered using it, but as she clasped a diamond necklace around her neck, its cold weight felt like armor. Tonight, she would not just be the CEO's wife. She would be a protector, a mother, and if necessary, a queen reclaiming her throne. The ballroom was a galaxy of manufactured stars. Diamonds glittered on wrinkled necks and slender wrists. Chandeliers dripped crystals like frozen tears, and the air hummed with the calculated buzz of power. Men in tailored tuxedos clustered together, their laughter sharp and conspiratorial, while women encased in silk and satin moved through the crowd with the predatory grace of sharks. She stood at the edge of the maelstrom, a glass of sparkling water in her hand, feeling like an anthropologist studying a foreign tribe. Her husband was in his element, a magnetic force at the center of it all. He moved from group to group, a handshake here, a shared joke there, effortlessly charming and utterly in control. From her vantage point near a marble column, she had a clear view, and she saw her, the woman from the gossip blog. Her name, she'd learned from a quick, heart-pounding search, was Katerina. Tonight, Katerina was a vision in crimson, a stark, fiery contrast to her own pale silver. The dress was audacious, clinging to every curve, with a slit that climbed daringly up her thigh. She radiated a confidence that was almost blinding, her laughter loud and unrestrained. She was everything the wife was not, bold, brash, and utterly unapologetic. She watched as Katerina orbited her husband. She never approached him directly when he was in a large group, but she was always there, on the periphery, her eyes locked on him. When he broke away to speak with a single dignitary, Katerina would materialize nearby, engaging someone in animated conversation, but always positioning herself within his line of sight. It was a carefully choreographed dance, a performance of proximity and restraint that was more telling than any public embrace. The wife saw the subtle signals they exchanged, a fleeting smile, a quick, almost imperceptible nod. It was a private language spoken in a crowded room, a secret shared in plain sight. Her heart hammered against her ribs, a frantic bird trapped in a cage of bone. She felt a wave of nausea, and for a moment, the glittering room tilted. She steadied herself against the cool marble, taking a deep, shaky breath. It's just stress, she told herself. The heat, the pregnancy. But she knew it was a lie. This was the cold, sickening certainty of betrayal. Needing to escape the oppressive atmosphere, she slipped away through a side door that led to a quieter, less crowded corridor. She found a small, empty lounge, furnished with velvet armchairs and dimly lit. She sank into one, the plush fabric a small comfort, and closed her eyes, pressing her fingers to her temples. The distant thrum of the orchestra was a dull, persistent ache in her head. A few moments later, the sound of voices and clicking heels approached. She froze, not wanting to be discovered in her moment of weakness. She shrank back into the shadows of the large armchair as two women entered the lounge, their voices dripping with the casual cruelty of the privileged. "Did you see her dress?" one woman said, her voice a nasal whine. "That red thing, it's practically screaming for attention." "Well, it certainly got his attention," the other replied with a throaty chuckle. "He hasn't taken his eyes off her all night." Poor thing, his wife, standing there looking like a lost, pregnant doll. It's almost tragic. "Almost," the first woman snorted. "Honestly, what did she expect? Men like him, they need more than a domestic goddess. They need fire. Katerina is fire. She's smart, too. Head of global marketing in 2 years. She knows what she wants, and she's not afraid to take it. I heard he's setting her up with her own boutique agency," the second woman added, her voice dropping to a conspiratorial whisper. "A special project funded by an anonymous backer. We all know who that is. He's building her a golden parachute for when the inevitable happens." The wife felt the air leave her lungs. An agency, a golden parachute. This wasn't a fleeting indiscretion. This was a plan, a future being built for another woman, while her own was being systematically dismantled. The women's laughter echoed in the small room as they moved on, leaving her alone in the wreckage of their words. The whispers had confirmed her worst fears, painting a picture far more devastating than she could have imagined. He wasn't just cheating, he was investing. He was building a new life, a new legacy with someone else. Her mind reeled, replaying the last few months with a horrifying new clarity. The late nights weren't just about work, they were about Katerina. The extended business trips weren't to Asia. They were romantic getaways disguised on an itinerary. The emotional distance, the polite detachment, it wasn't stress. It was guilt. It was the slow, deliberate process of his withdrawal from their marriage. He had already left her. His body was just catching up. A cold fury began to replace the nausea. It started as a flicker in the pit of her stomach and grew into a blazing inferno. How dare he? How dare he stand in front of all these people, playing the part of the devoted husband and philanthropist while actively planning his exit? How dare he let her stand there, her body swollen with his child, and subject her to this silent public humiliation? She thought of the seal. It was kept in a small, fireproof box in the back of her closet, hidden beneath old photo albums and keepsakes from a life that now felt like a stranger's. It had been given to her by his father on their wedding day. The old man, a titan of a bygone era who had built the company from nothing, had pulled her aside. His eyes, usually sharp and calculating, had been soft that day. "My son is a good man," he had said, his voice raspy with age. "But he has a flaw. He sometimes confuses what is valuable with what is shiny. This company was built on a promise, to create, not just to profit. This seal," he explained, pressing the heavy ornate object into her hand, "was my father's. It represents the heart of the company. The board respects it. Legally, it grants the holder a deciding vote in any matter concerning the company's charter. Morally, it's a reminder of our soul. He'll give you everything, my dear, but you keep this. You are the keeper of our conscience now." At the time, she had seen it as a sentimental, slightly eccentric gesture, a piece of family history. Now she understood. The old man had seen the flaw in his son. He had seen the ambition that could curdle into ruthlessness. He hadn't given her a gift. He had given her a weapon, a key, a failsafe. She stood up, her body no longer trembling. The decision was made. The fury had forged itself into a diamond-hard resolve. She was not a doll. She was not tragic. And she was done being a ghost. She walked out of the lounge and back toward the ballroom, her posture straight, her head held high. The whispers of the two women had been cruel, but they had given her a gift, the truth, and the truth had set her free. She moved through the crowd, her eyes scanning for her husband. She found him near the orchestra, finally speaking with Katerina. There was no pretense of talking to others now. It was just the two of them, their heads close together, a picture of illicit intimacy. She watched them for a long moment, letting the image burn itself into her memory. She saw the way his eyes crinkled when he smiled at her, a smile she hadn't seen directed at herself in years. She saw the possessive way Katerina touched his lapel. They were comfortable, secure in their secret world. They had underestimated her. They had mistaken her quiet grief for weakness, her gentle nature for fragility. They were about to learn how wrong they were. She turned, not with a tear, but with a plan, and walked out of the glittering ballroom, leaving the galaxy of fake stars behind her. The gilded cage was about to be broken. The silence in the penthouse that night was different. It was no longer the hollow, empty quiet of loneliness, but the charged, heavy silence of an impending storm. The air crackled with unspoken words, with the weight of years of deception. He came home hours after she did, long after the last of the gala's champagne had been drunk and the final false smile had faded. She was waiting for him, not in their bed, but in the vast, sterile living room. She sat in a single armchair, bathed in the soft glow of one low lamp. The city lights a cold, indifferent audience behind her. He stopped in the doorway, his hand still on the knob, sensing the shift in the atmosphere. He loosened his bow tie, his movements slow and cautious, like an animal sensing a trap. "You're still up," he said. It wasn't a question, it was an accusation. "We need to talk," she replied, her voice unnervingly calm. It didn't waver, it didn't break. It was the voice of a stranger. He sighed, a sound of pure exhaustion and annoyance. "It's almost 3 in the morning. Can't this wait?" He ran a hand through his perfectly styled hair, a gesture of frustration she knew well. He was already preparing his defenses, building his walls. "No," she said, her gaze steady and unwavering. "It can't." He walked further into the room, shedding his jacket and tossing it onto another chair with careless disregard. He moved to the bar, his back to her, and poured himself a generous measure of scotch. The clinking of the crystal decanter against the glass was the only sound. "What is it?" he asked, his back still turned. "Is it about the gala? Did someone say something to upset you?" The condescension in his tone was a familiar sting. He was already framing her as emotional, irrational, pregnant. "They didn't have to," she said, her voice cutting through his pretense. "I have eyes. I saw you with her, with Katerina." He stilled, his hand frozen around his glass. He didn't turn around. In the reflection of the dark window behind the bar, she could see his face, his expression momentarily unguarded. It was a flicker of panic, quickly masked by practiced composure. He took a long swallow of his drink before slowly turning to face her. "She's my head of marketing. We were discussing the campaign launch. It was work." The lie was so bald, so insulting in its simplicity, that a bitter laugh almost escaped her. "Work," she repeated, the word tasting like poison. "Is that what you call it? The stolen glances, the secret smiles, the way she looks at you like she owns you?" She stood up, her body feeling heavy but her spirit strangely light. The truth was liberating. "I overheard some women in the lounge. They were talking about the boutique agency you're funding for her. Your special project. Your investment in her future. Your future." The color drained from his face. His corporate mask of cool control finally cracked, revealing the panicked man beneath. He stared at her, his mouth slightly agape, the gears in his brilliant mind spinning, searching for an escape route. A new lie, a plausible deniability. But he found none. Her calm certainty had disarmed him. "Who told you?" he finally managed, his voice a hoarse whisper. It was a confession in 2 words. "Does it matter?" she shot back, taking a step towards him. "You've been building a life with her behind my back, while I've been here, waiting for you, carrying your child, our child." Her voice finally broke on the last words, the pain she had held at bay for so long finally surging through. Tears welled in her eyes, hot and furious. "How long?" she demanded. "How long has this been going on?" He looked away, unable to meet her gaze. He ran his hand over his face, the picture of a man cornered. "A little over a year," he admitted, the words barely audible. A year, a whole year of lies. A year of feeling like she was going crazy, of blaming herself for the distance between them. A year of him coming home from another woman's bed and sliding into hers. The nausea returned, violent and overwhelming. She swayed, and for a second she thought she might be sick. She gripped the back of the armchair to steady herself. A year, she breathed, the word a death sentence for the life she thought they had. Was any of it real? The last year? When you held my hand at the first ultrasound? When you felt our baby kick for the first time? Was all of that a lie too? No, of course not, he said quickly, taking a step towards her, his hand outstretched. I was confused. Things at work were... It's complicated. Complicated? She flinched away from his touch as if burned. Don't you dare hide behind that word. It's not complicated, it's cowardly. You were too much of a coward to tell me the truth. You let me believe we were still a team, that we were building a future together, when you were planning your escape. The dam of her composure broke completely. The tears streamed down her face, unchecked. The hurt was a physical thing, a crushing weight on her chest. I lost a baby with you, she sobbed, the words torn from the deepest part of her soul. We lost a baby, and I thought this time, this baby would heal us, that it would bring you back to me. How could you do this to us? To me? To this child? He finally looked at her, and for the first time that night, she saw a flicker of genuine remorse in his eyes. Not just the panic of being caught, but a glimmer of the man he used to be. The man who had held her as she wept in that hospital room years ago. I know, he said, his voice thick with an emotion she couldn't quite name. Guilt? Pity? I'm sorry, I never wanted to hurt you. You did more than hurt me, she said, her voice dropping to a whisper raw with pain. You broke me. You broke everything we were. An exhausted silence fell between them. The confession hung in the air, ugly and undeniable. There was no going back. The carefully constructed facade of their marriage had been shattered, and all that was left were the sharp, glittering fragments. What do you want? He asked, his voice defeated. A divorce? Half of everything? It's yours. I won't fight you. She looked at him, at this man who was suddenly a stranger to her. He thought this was about money. He was already trying to manage the situation, to mitigate the damages, to settle. He still didn't understand. He didn't understand her at all. I don't want your money, she said, wiping her tears with the back of her hand, a new resolve hardening her voice. I want you to understand what you've lost, what you've thrown away. She turned and walked toward their bedroom, her steps steady. She didn't look back. The unveiling was complete. He had revealed his betrayal. Soon she would reveal her power. The storm had broken, and the real battle was about to begin. A week after the devastating confession, she found herself in another gilded room for another mandatory performance. This time it was a press luncheon celebrating the company's new international headquarters, a gleaming skyscraper that had redefined the city's skyline. Her husband had insisted she attend. We need to present a united front, he'd said, the words cold and strategic, for the media, for the shareholders, until we figure things out. It was a bitter pill to swallow, to stand by his side and smile for the cameras, the chasm between them wider than ever. But she agreed, not for him, but for herself. It was a tactical decision. She needed to maintain her position, to observe, to wait for the right moment. The restaurant he'd chosen was on the top floor of the new building, a place of panoramic views and hushed, reverent tones. The city's most influential journalists and business leaders were there, their conversations a low murmur beneath the clinking of silverware. She sat at the head table, a perfect prop, nodding and smiling as her husband spoke eloquently about vision, innovation, and the future. She felt a million miles away, an actress in a foreign film, speaking lines she didn't understand. And then she saw her, Katerina. She was seated at a prominent table nearby, surrounded by her marketing team. She was holding court, animated and radiant, a glass of champagne in her hand. Her crimson dress from the gala had been replaced by a sharp white power suit that was both professional and undeniably sexy. Her eyes, bright with triumph, kept flicking toward the head table, towards her. The wife tried to ignore her, to focus on the bland risotto in front of her. But Katerina's presence was a magnetic force of malice. She could feel the woman's gaze on her, sharp and dissecting. After the main speeches were over and people began to mingle, she knew a confrontation was inevitable. Katerina was not the type to let an opportunity for a power play pass her by, She had escaped to the powder room, needing a moment of reprieve from the suffocating pretense of the luncheon. She stood before the large, gilt-edged mirror, splashing cold water on her face, trying to quell the anxiety fluttering in her chest. When she looked up, Katerina was standing behind her reflection sharp and smug in the mirror. "I thought that was you," Katerina said, her voice smooth as silk but laced with venom. She moved to the sink beside her, pulling a lipstick from her purse. "You're looking tired. Pregnancy can really take it out of you, can it?" The wife didn't answer. She met Katerina's eyes in the mirror, her own gaze flat and cold. Katerina laughed, a short, sharp sound. "He worries about you, you know. He says you're so fragile, especially after what happened before." The casual cruelty of the remark, the violation of her most private pain, was like a physical blow. Katerina knew about the baby she had lost. He had shared that sacred grief with this woman. He had given her that too. "You should really be at home resting," Katerina continued, applying a slash of bold red to her lips. She capped the lipstick with a decisive click. "This high-powered world, it's not for everyone. It requires a certain resilience, a certain strength." Her eyes raked over the wife's swollen form with undisguised contempt. "Some women are made for the boardroom. Others are made for the nursery." The wife felt the fury, white-hot and potent, rise within her, but she held it back. To lash out here, to cause a scene, would be to play Katerina's game. It would be a victory for her. She would be dismissed as the hysterical, hormonal wife. So she remained silent, her stillness a stark contrast to Katerina's performative confidence. Katerina clearly took her silence as weakness. She leaned closer, her voice dropping to a conspiratorial whisper, though it was loud enough for anyone entering the powder room to hear. "I just don't want you to have any false hope. He and I, we have a future. We have an understanding. He's a man who needs a partner, not a patient. He needs someone who can stand beside him, not behind him. Once the baby is born, he's going to do the right thing. For everyone." She patted the wife's arm, a gesture of feigned sympathy that was more insulting than a slap. "Take care of yourself," she purred, before turning and gliding out of the powder room, leaving a trail of expensive perfume and poison in her wake. The wife stood frozen for a long moment, her knuckles white as she gripped the edge of the marble sink. The mockingbird had sung her song of triumph. She had mocked her pregnancy, her grief, her very womanhood. She had laid out her victory plan with sickening certainty, confident that the wife was a broken, powerless thing who would simply step aside. But Katerina, in her arrogance, had made a critical mistake. She thought the battle was for a man. She thought the prize was the CEO. She had no idea that the real war was for the soul of a company, for a legacy. She had no idea that the quiet, pregnant woman she had just insulted held the one thing that could dismantle her entire future. A strange, cold calm washed over the wife. The tears were gone, replaced by an icy resolve. Katerina had just handed her the final piece of motivation she needed. This was no longer just about a broken heart and a betrayed marriage. It was about justice. It was about proving that strength wasn't loud and dressed in a power suit. Sometimes strength was quiet, patient, and underestimated. She looked at her reflection. Katerina was wrong. She wasn't tired. She was waiting. She wasn't fragile. She was forged in the fires of loss and grief. The mockingbird had sung her song, but the canary in the coal mine was about to prove that the most dangerous threats are the ones you never see coming. She smoothed down her dress over her belly, a protective, primal gesture. "She has no idea who we are," she whispered to the child within. She walked out of the powder room, not as a victim, but as a warrior preparing for her final, decisive battle. The luncheon was over, but the war had just begun. The days following the luncheon were a blur of suffocating silence and churning emotions. She and her husband existed as two ghosts haunting the same opulent mausoleum, their conversations reduced to terse, necessary exchanges about schedules and appointments. He slept in the guest room, a tacit acknowledgement of the irreparable fracture between them. But the physical distance did little to quell the storm raging inside her. Katerina's taunts echoed in her mind, each venomous word a fresh twist of the knife. "He says you're so fragile. Others are made for the nursery." The humiliation was a constant, bitter taste in her mouth. She would spend hours in the nursery they had designed together. the soft grays and yellows of the room now seeming to mock her. She'd run her hands over the smooth wood of the crib, trace the outline of the hand-painted stars on the ceiling, and feel a profound and terrifying conflict. A part of her, the wounded, heartbroken part, wanted to flee, to pack a bag, disappear, and raise this child far away from the poison of her husband's world. She imagined a small, quiet life in a town where no one knew their name, a life of simple, honest joys. But another, fiercer part of her refused to be driven out. It was the part of her that Katerina had awakened with her cruelty. It was the primal, protective instinct of a mother, not just for the child in her womb, but for the woman she had almost allowed herself to forget. Why should she be the one to run? Why should she be the one to sacrifice her home, her stability because of their betrayal? This was her home. This was her child's birthright. And that company, a part of it belonged to her, entrusted to her by a man who had seen her true worth long before his son had forgotten it. Her nights were sleepless. She would lie awake, her hand on her belly, feeling the powerful kicks and rolls of her baby, a constant, living reminder of what was at stake. During these long, dark hours, the memories of her first loss would return, not as a wave of grief, but as a source of unexpected strength. She remembered the crushing emptiness of the hospital, the clinical sympathy of the nurses, the way her husband had seemed to shrink from her pain, unable to bear its weight. She had survived that. She had navigated the darkest corners of sorrow and found her way back to the light. She had done it alone. The realization was both heartbreaking and empowering. She had never been fragile. Her grief had been a crucible, and it had forged her into something stronger than steel. Katerina, with her sharp suits and boardroom ambitions, knew nothing of real strength. She began to think about the seal, not as a weapon of revenge, but as an instrument of justice. She retrieved the fireproof box from her closet and sat on the floor, the heavy, ornate object cool in her hands. It was intricately carved, depicting an old-world craftsman hammering a piece of steel on an anvil, sparks flying from the impact. Around the edge, etched in Latin, were the words, Integritas vis creatio. Integrity, strength, creation, the founding principles of the company. The principles her husband had forgotten in his relentless pursuit of profit and power. The principles he had desecrated by promoting a woman like Katerina, who embodied the exact opposite of that ethos. The company's annual shareholder meeting was in 2 weeks. It was the most important event of the year, a theatrical performance where her husband would stand before the board and the major investors to report on his triumphs and lay out his vision for the future. It would be his coronation, a celebration of the record profits and aggressive expansion he had overseen. Katerina would be there, in the front row, a symbol of his new, ruthless vision, and she, the pregnant wife, would be expected to be in her usual place, a silent, smiling prop, endorsing his reign. The idea began to form, a daring, audacious plan. It was terrifying. It would mean stepping out of the shadows and onto the world's biggest corporate stage. It would mean facing down not just her husband and his mistress, but an entire boardroom of powerful, intimidating men. She would be exposing the dirty laundry of her marriage to the world, and there was no telling how they would react. They could dismiss her as a scorned woman, a liability. The press would have a field day. The scandal could tank the company's stock price. For days, she wrestled with the decision. She would walk the silent halls of the penthouse, the plan a living thing inside her, growing alongside her child. She would stand by the window looking down at the city, feeling the weight of the choice before her. Was this about her? About a wife's revenge? Or was it bigger than that? She thought of his father, the old man with the kind eyes and the deep understanding of his son's character. He hadn't just given her the seal, he had given her a responsibility. You are the keeper of our conscience now. He had entrusted her with the company's soul. Her husband, in his affair with Katerina, hadn't just betrayed her, he had betrayed his own legacy. Katerina's rise in the company, she knew, was not just about their personal relationship. It represented a cultural shift. The whispers she'd heard were not just about office gossip. They were about a new toxic corporate culture, one of ruthless ambition, of cutting ethical corners for the sake of profit. a culture Katerina championed. The special project, the boutique agency, was likely a shell corporation, a way to funnel money or handle deals that the main company couldn't touch without scrutiny. The betrayal was deeper than infidelity. It was a rot at the core of the empire his father had built. The turning point came one evening, a few days before the meeting. She was in the nursery when her husband came to the door. He looked tired, his shoulders slumped. "I've spoken to my lawyers," he said, his voice devoid of emotion. "They'll draw up the papers. It will be generous." She looked at him, truly looked at him, and felt not hatred, but a profound pity. He was still trying to solve this like a business deal, with contracts and settlements. He couldn't see the human wreckage he had created. "I don't want your papers," she said quietly. "Not yet." He looked confused. "What do you want then?" "I want to attend the shareholder meeting," she said, her voice steady. "I will sit in my usual seat. I will play my part. And after that, we can discuss the papers." A wave of relief washed over his face. He thought she was acquiescing, agreeing to his terms for a quiet, dignified exit. "Of course," he said quickly. "Thank you. That would be best for everyone." He didn't see the fire in her eyes. He didn't understand that she wasn't agreeing to an end. She was setting the stage for a new beginning. As he walked away, leaving her alone in the soft light of the nursery, her decision was cemented. The storm within her had finally calmed, leaving a clear, cold, and resolute path forward. She was not just fighting for herself anymore. She was fighting for her child's legacy, for the soul of a company, and for the promise she had made to an old man long ago. She would let them have their stage. She would let them have their moment of triumph. And then, with the weight of history in her hands, she would bring the curtain down. Before the penthouse, before the glittering galas and the crushing weight of a loveless marriage, there was a small, sun-drenched apartment filled with laughter and the smell of paint. She had been an artist, a painter whose canvases were filled with bold, vibrant colors and swirling, emotional landscapes. He had been a young, hungry executive, not yet the king of his empire, but a prince with a universe of ambition in his eyes. He'd stumbled into her gallery one rainy afternoon and had been captivated not by her art, but by the passionate, paint-smeared woman who spoke of color and light as if they were living things. Their early years were a whirlwind of dreams shared over cheap wine and takeout cartons. He spoke of building a legacy, of transforming his father's solid, respectable company into a global powerhouse. She spoke of creating art that mattered, that made people feel something real in a world that was becoming increasingly artificial. They were two halves of a whole, his pragmatism and her passion, his ambition and her soul. He had loved her creativity, her emotional depth. He'd called her his conscience, his true north. The first pregnancy had been a joyous, unexpected surprise. They were thrilled, terrified, and utterly united. They'd spent weekends painting the small second bedroom in shades of sunshine yellow, dreaming of the life they would build within those four walls. The loss, when it came, was sudden and silent. A routine checkup that ended in a quiet, sterile room, with a doctor speaking in hushed, somber tones. The world of vibrant color she had inhabited bleached into a stark, unforgiving gray. The grief affected them in profoundly different ways. For her, it was an internal collapse. The desire to paint vanished, the colors fading from her mind. Her art had always come from a place of deep emotion, and the only emotion she had left was a pain so vast and shapeless, she couldn't have begun to capture it on canvas. She retreated into herself, into the gray, silent world of her sorrow. For him, the grief was something to be conquered, to be outmaneuvered. He couldn't fix her pain, and the helplessness infuriated him. So he turned to the one thing he could control, his work. He poured all his energy, all his frustration, all his desperate need for control into the company. He worked with a relentless, punishing ferocity, as if he could outrun the grief that haunted their small apartment. He started seeing her pain not as a shared wound, but as an obstacle, a weight holding him back. Her silence, born of sorrow, became an accusation he couldn't answer. This was when he truly began to change. His father, the old patriarch, had run the company with a steady hand and a strong moral compass. He believed in quality, in loyalty to his employees, in building things that lasted. His son, driven by his new desperate ambition, saw this as old-fashioned, slow, inefficient. He began to champion a more aggressive, ruthless approach. He argued for outsourcing, for streamlining departments, which meant firing people who had been with the company for decades, for acquiring competitors not to build them up, but to strip them for parts. His father fought him, leading to titanic arguments that she could hear through the closed doors of the old man's study. It was during one of these bitter conflicts that the patriarch's health, already fragile, began to fail. Shortly before he passed away, he called her to his bedside. Her husband was not in the room. "He's losing his way," the old man had whispered, his breath shallow. "He thinks strength is about being the loudest voice in the room, about leaving a trail of broken things behind you. He's forgotten that true strength is in the foundation." He gestured to a small, ornate box on his bedside table. "My grandfather was a blacksmith. He forged the seal himself. He believed that a company, like a good piece of steel, must be shaped by guiding principles: integrity, strength, creation." He had explained the seal's power to her then. It was a relic from the company's original charter, a strange, archaic bylaw that had never been removed. In the event of a vote concerning a fundamental change to the company's charter or a challenge to the moral leadership of the CEO, the holder of the seal could invoke it. It acted as a veto, a super vote that held the weight of the founding family's entire share block. It was a check on pure corporate power, a reminder of the company's soul. "Your husband knows it exists," the old man had said, his eyes pleading with her. "But he thinks I have it, that it will be buried with me. I'm giving it to you. He loves you. Deep down, you are still his true north. He will listen to you. Be the keeper of our conscience. Don't let him turn this company into something his grandfather would be ashamed of." She had accepted the box, her hands trembling, not fully understanding the weight of the burden he was placing on her. After he died, her husband, now the undisputed CEO, had catapulted the company into a new stratosphere of profitability. And in the process, he had left her, and the values his father cherished, far behind. They moved into the penthouse. Her paintbrushes gathered dust. The vibrant, passionate artist was replaced by the quiet, subdued wife. She had buried the seal away, along with the woman she used to be. The trauma of her loss, compounded by her husband's emotional abandonment, had convinced her that woman was gone forever. But now, sitting on the floor of her closet in the cold light of the present, she realized the old man had been both right and wrong. Her husband had stopped listening to her long ago, but the old man was right about her strength. He had seen it when no one else had, not even her. He hadn't entrusted the company's soul to the CEO's wife. He had entrusted it to her, to the passionate, fierce woman who understood that some things were more valuable than money. Katerina's mockery, her husband's betrayal, they had been the hammer striking the anvil. The pain had been the fire, and it had forged her anew. She was not the fragile, broken woman they saw. She was the granddaughter-in-law of a blacksmith. She understood foundations, and she was about to show them all that the quietest person in the room is often the one holding the most power. The echoes of the past were not haunting her anymore. They were guiding her. They were her map, her armor, and her sword. The auditorium was cavernous, cold, and packed to capacity, a cathedral of capitalism. On the stage, a massive screen displayed the company's logo above a sleek, minimalist lectern. The air was thick with the scent of money and anticipation. Rows of dark-suited men and women, the board of directors, major shareholders, and industry analysts, sat with disciplined stillness, their faces illuminated by the glow of their tablets. The press, a restless pack of predators, were cordoned off to the side, their cameras poised like sniper rifles. She walked in on her husband's arm, a ghost in silver-gray silk. Her presence was a formality, a piece of stage dressing. She was the dutiful wife, her pregnant form a symbol of the CEO's virility and legacy, a perfect picture for the cover of Fortune magazine. He guided her to her seat in the front row, squeezed her hand with a performative affection that made her skin crawl, and then ascended the stage to a round of robust, reverent applause. She settled into her chair, her heart a steady, rhythmic drum against her ribs. She was terrified, but a strange, preternatural calm had enveloped her. In her handbag, wrapped in a silk scarf, lay the heavy, cold weight of the seal. She looked at the faces in the front row. There was the grizzled, old money chairman of the board, a man who had been her father-in-law's closest friend. There were the shrewd, calculating venture capitalists who saw people as numbers on a spreadsheet. And there, sitting just 2 seats away, was Katerina. Katerina was a vision of triumph. She wore a tailored black dress, severe and elegant. She radiated an aura of untouchable power, her posture perfect, her expression serene. When their eyes met, Katerina gave her a slow, deliberate nod, a gesture of dismissal, a final acknowledgement of her victory. The wife simply looked back, her expression unreadable, and then turned her attention to the stage. Her husband was in his element. He was a master orator, weaving a narrative of unprecedented success and boundless future potential. He spoke of profit margins, of market penetration, of aggressive acquisitions. The numbers he presented were staggering, and a pleased murmur rippled through the audience. He was the conquering hero, and this was his victory lap. And a key driver of this success, he announced, his voice booming with pride, has been the revitalization of our global marketing strategy, spearheaded by the most brilliant mind in the industry. A woman whose vision and tenacity will be a cornerstone of our future. Please join me in congratulating our new Senior Vice President of Global Strategy, Katerina. He gestured towards Katerina. The spotlight swung to her. She stood basking in the applause, her smile a dazzling display of perfectly white teeth. She looked from the CEO to the audience, and then, for a final, triumphant moment, her gaze landed on the wife. It was a look of pure, unadulterated victory. The queen was dead. Long live the queen. Her husband continued, Katerina will also be heading a new, independently funded venture, a boutique innovation hub, to explore more agile investment opportunities, ensuring our dominance for decades to come. This was it, the public anointing, the legitimization of their affair, disguised as a brilliant business move, the creation of the golden parachute the women at the gala had whispered about. As the applause for Katerina subsided, her husband prepared to move to his closing remarks. This was her moment. Her hand went to her purse. Her fingers closed around the seal. It was now or never. Excuse me. The voice was quiet, but amplified by the microphone on the table in front of her. It carried through the silent auditorium. It was her voice. Every head turned. A confused, shocked silence fell over the room. On stage, her husband froze, his smile faltering. He stared at her, his eyes wide with disbelief and growing panic. She stood up slowly, deliberately. Every eye was on her. She felt 1,000 points of pressure, but her resolve was a shield. My apologies for the interruption, she said, her voice clear and steady, betraying none of the terror she felt. But I believe a crucial piece of company history has been overlooked in this presentation. She walked from her seat towards a small set of stairs at the side of the stage. A security guard moved to intercept her, but she gave him a look of such calm authority that he hesitated. Her husband, regaining some composure, spoke into the microphone. My wife she's not feeling well. The pregnancy, I am feeling perfectly fine, she said, now standing on the stage a few feet away from him. She turned to face the audience, to face the board, to face Katerina, whose smug expression had been replaced by one of utter bewilderment. My husband speaks of a new vision for this company, she began. A vision of agility and aggressive acquisition, a vision that has produced impressive profits. But I am here to ask, at what cost? She looked directly at the chairman of the board. You knew my father-in-law. You knew the principles upon which he and his father built this empire. Were they not integrity, strength, and creation? A murmur went through the older members of the board. The chairman stared at her, his expression unreadable. The new agile investment opportunities my husband mentioned, she continued, her voice gaining strength, are a shell company designed to engage in hostile takeovers of smaller family-run businesses. Businesses my father-in-law once mentored, to strip them of their assets and discard their employees. This is not creation. This is destruction. A gasp rippled through the auditorium. Her husband's face was ashen. This is an outrageous and baseless accusation, he stammered. Is it? She countered, turning to him. Then perhaps you can explain the wire transfers to the innovation hub from offshore accounts, timed perfectly with the bankruptcies of 3 of your company's oldest suppliers? She had done her research. The sleepless nights had not been spent just wrestling with her emotions, but with a private investigator, a quiet, meticulous man who had uncovered the rot beneath the floorboards. She turned back to the audience. This is not just a change in business strategy, it is a change in the company's charter, a shift in its very soul, a shift championed by the new senior vice president. She let her gaze fall on Katerina, who now looked physically ill. And according to the original company charter, she said, her voice ringing with authority, any such fundamental change requires more than a simple board vote. It requires the consent of the family's legacy. She reached into her handbag, pulled out the silk scarf and unwrapped the seal. She held it up for all to see. The stage lights glinted off the old carved metal. This is the founder's seal, she declared, entrusted to me by the last chairman before his death. As the holder of this seal, I represent the founding family's controlling interest, and I am invoking its power. I do not consent. The auditorium erupted. Shouts, gasps, the frantic clicking of cameras. The chairman of the board was on his feet, his face a mask of astonishment. Katerina looked as if she had been turned to stone. Her husband stared at the seal, then at her, his eyes filled with a dawning, horrified understanding. He had seen her as a fragile doll, a domestic goddess, an emotional casualty. He had never, in his wildest nightmares, imagined she was the chairman. His gambit had failed. Hers had just begun. The aftermath was a hurricane. The shareholder meeting descended into chaos, ending abruptly as the board members, led by the stunned but galvanized chairman, immediately called for a closed-door emergency session. The press exploded with a frenzy of speculation. Headlines screamed about the corporate coup, the scorned wife's revenge, the secret power play that had rocked the city's most powerful company. She was escorted out through a private exit, shielded from the cacophony by the same security guard who had tried to stop her. He looked at her with a newfound respect. She didn't go back to the penthouse. She went to a quiet hotel suite she had booked under her maiden name, a sanctuary prepared in advance for the fallout. She turned off her phone, ignoring the hundreds of calls and texts that were undoubtedly flooding in. For the first time in over a year, she felt a sense of peace. The storm that had raged within her had finally broken, and in its wake was a quiet, clean exhaustion. The board meeting, she learned later, was brutal. Armed with the evidence from her private investigator and the undeniable authority of the seal, the narrative was reframed. It was no longer about a marital dispute. It was about a CEO who had abandoned his fiduciary and ethical duty. The hostile takeover scheme, the shell company, the covering of tracks, it was a betrayal not just of his wife, but of every shareholder in the room. His affair with Katerina was merely a symptom of the deeper disease of his character. By the end of the day, he was forced to resign. His severance package was slashed to the bare minimum required by his contract. Katerina was fired immediately, her special project dismantled, and she was facing a potential lawsuit from the company for misuse of corporate funds. Their gilded future, built on lies and ruthless ambition, had crumbled to dust in a matter of hours. The mockingbird's song had been silenced for good. Her husband tried to see her once. He showed up at the hotel, his face haggard, his bespoke suit rumpled. He looked like a king who had been deposed overnight, lost and bewildered. She agreed to meet him in the hotel lobby, a neutral space. Why, he asked, his voice hoarse. Was all this for revenge? To destroy me? She looked at the man she had once loved, the father of her child, and felt a surprising lack of anger. All that was left was a sad, hollow ache for what they had lost, for the man he could have been. No, she said, her voice gentle. This wasn't about destroying you. It was about saving what your father built. You confused strength with cruelty. You thought integrity was a weakness. You surrounded yourself with people who reflected your own flaws. I did this for the legacy you were throwing away, and I did it for our child, so that one day they can be proud of the name they carry, not because of its wealth, but because of its worth. He stared at her, finally understanding the depth of his miscalculation. He had not just lost a wife, he had lost his moral compass, and he hadn't even realized she was the one holding it the entire time. He nodded slowly, a broken man, and left without another word. In the weeks that followed, the dust began to settle. The old chairman of the board, acting as interim CEO, reached out to her. He asked her to take a permanent seat on the board, as the official representative of the founding family's trust. Your father-in-law was right about you, he'd said. You are the conscience of this company. After much thought, she accepted. Not to run the company, but to guide it, to ensure it never lost its way again. She sold the cold, sterile penthouse and bought a beautiful old house with a large, sun-filled garden. She set up a studio for herself, the scent of turpentine and oil paints once again filling her life. The colors started coming back, slowly at first, then in a rush of vibrant, joyful creation. 2 months later, she gave birth to a healthy, beautiful baby girl. As she held her daughter in her arms for the first time, looking down at the tiny, perfect face, she felt a love so fierce and profound, it eclipsed all the pain that had come before. This was her true legacy. This was her creation. She was no longer just the CEO's wife, a victim, or even a victor. She was a mother, an artist, a guardian of a legacy, and the architect of her own life. She had walked through the fire of betrayal and emerged not scorched, but forged. The ashes of her old life had become the embers of a new, brighter future, one she would build on her own terms, with integrity, strength, and a whole lot of love. Now, as this story comes to an end, we're left with her powerful choice. She could have taken the settlement and disappeared, starting a quiet new life away from the drama. Instead, she chose to fight, not just for herself, but for a legacy and a set of principles she believed in. So, the question for you is, what would you have done in her place? Would you have walked away to protect your peace and your child from the public fallout? Or would you have stepped into the fire to reclaim your power and fight for what you believed was right? Let us know in the comments below.